The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Samuel Nguyen stood there on the hiking trail, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. His dark eyes held something Alexander King had never seen before, something that made his heart hammer against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. "I said I wanted to clear my head," Samuel repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the truth is, I just wanted to walk next to you." Alexander felt the world tilt on its axis. 3 hours of hiking, 3 hours of Samuel matching his pace step for step, and now this confession that changed everything. The afternoon sun filtered through the pine trees, casting dancing shadows across Samuel's face, and Alexander could see the vulnerability there, raw and unguarded. Alexander's voice caught in his throat. How could he explain that he'd been hoping for exactly this moment for months? That every casual invitation to hike, every shared coffee, every late-night conversation had been building to this single perfect admission? Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story is about to take you on an emotional journey you won't forget. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, suspended between friendship and something infinitely more precious, we need to go back to where it all began. 6 months earlier, Alexander King had been living in a carefully constructed bubble of contentment. His small apartment in the city was organized to perfection, his job at the marketing firm provided steady income and mild satisfaction, and his social life consisted of a comfortable routine of gym sessions, weekend brunches with college friends, and the occasional date that never seemed to lead anywhere meaningful. He told himself he was happy. He told himself that the restless feeling that crept in during quiet moments was just the normal dissatisfaction that came with approaching 30. He told himself that the reason his relationships never worked out was simply because he hadn't met the right woman yet. Then Samuel Nguyen walked into his life like a hurricane disguised as a gentle breeze. It happened on a Thursday morning in March. Alexander was standing in line at his usual coffee shop, scrolling through emails on his phone, when he heard a voice behind him that made something inside his chest flutter unexpectedly. "Excuse me, do you know if they have oat milk? I'm lactose intolerant, and I made the mistake of assuming they'd have alternatives without checking first." Alexander turned around and found himself looking into warm brown eyes that seemed to hold flecks of gold in the morning light. The man was about his height, with black hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, wearing a navy sweater that brought out the richness of his skin tone. There was something about his smile, genuine and slightly self-deprecating, that made Alexander want to keep looking. Alexander managed, his usual eloquence deserting him entirely. Quote 5. Samuel's smile widened, and Alexander felt heat creep up his neck. "Thanks, I'm Samuel, by the way. I just moved to the neighborhood last week, and I'm still figuring out the local spots." "Alexander, and this is definitely the best coffee within a 6-block radius." He paused, then added impulsively, "If you want, I could show you some other good places around here sometime, for someone new to the area." The words were out before Alexander could examine why he'd offered. Why the thought of this stranger disappearing back into the crowd of the city made something in his chest tighten, with unexpected loss. Samuel said, and when he smiled, Alexander felt like he was seeing sunlight for the first time. They exchanged numbers while waiting for their drinks, making plans to meet for lunch that weekend. Alexander told himself it was just being neighborly, just helping out a fellow transplant to the city. But as he walked to work that morning, Samuel's number saved in his phone, he found himself replaying their brief conversation, cataloging the way Samuel's eyes crinkled when he laughed, the way he'd said Alexander's name like he was testing how it felt on his tongue. The lunch turned into dinner. Dinner turned into weekend hikes. Weekend hikes turned into Samuel becoming a constant presence in Alexander's carefully ordered life. And somehow, instead of disrupting that order, Samuel made everything feel more vibrant, more alive. Samuel was a freelance graphic designer who worked from home, which meant he had a flexibility that Alexander envied. He was originally from California, had moved to the city for a fresh start after ending a long-term relationship with his college girlfriend. He loved hiking, obscure documentaries, and cooking elaborate meals that he insisted on sharing with friends. "I can't eat a whole lasagna by myself," Samuel would say, showing up at Alexander's apartment with a casserole dish and that smile that made Alexander's carefully maintained boundaries to feel increasingly fragile. Besides, food tastes better when it's shared. Alexander found himself looking forward to these impromptu dinner invitations with an intensity that should have worried him. Samuel would commandeer his kitchen, moving around the small space with an easy confidence, and Alexander would sit at his breakfast bar, supposedly reading or answering emails, but actually just watching Samuel work. There was something mesmerizing about the way Samuel moved, the unconscious grace in his gestures, the way he hummed under his breath while he cooked. You know, you could help instead of just supervising, Samuel said one evening, catching Alexander staring. He was standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven, and when he looked over his shoulder, his hair fell across his forehead in a way that made Alexander's fingers itch to brush it back. Code of 13, Alexander replied, forcing his voice to stay light. Code 4 turn, code 4 and code 6, and as Samuel turned fully then, leaning back against the counter, and studied Alexander with those perceptive eyes. Quote 17. The observation hit closer to home than Alexander was comfortable with. He deflected with humor, as he always did when conversations started to venture into territory that felt too revealing. Quote 5, quote 19. Samuel's smile was soft, understanding in a way that made Alexander's chest tight. Quote poinachon. The nickname sent warmth spreading through Alexander's body like honey. No one had called him Alex since college, but when Samuel said it, it sounded right, like a name he'd been waiting his whole life to hear. These moments of unexpected intimacy became more frequent as their friendship deepened. Samuel had a way of seeing through Alexander's carefully maintained composure, of asking questions that made Alexander examine parts of himself he'd been content to leave unexplored. Samuel asked one evening as they sat on Alexander's small balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the city lights twinkle below them. Like you're living someone else's idea of what your life should look like. Alexander considered the question, rolling his wine glass between his palms. It was late May, and the air was warm and soft, carrying the scent of blooming flowers from the community garden across the street. Samuel was sitting close enough that Alexander could smell his cologne, something subtle and woody that made him want to lean closer. Sometimes, Alexander admitted, especially at work, I feel like I'm playing a role, saying the things I'm supposed to say, wanting the things I'm supposed to want. What do you actually want? The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities that Alexander wasn't ready to examine. Because the truth was, sitting here with Samuel, sharing wine and honest conversation under the stars, felt more right than anything else in his life. The truth was, he'd started measuring every other experience against moments like this, and everything else came up lacking. I don't know, he said finally. I thought I did, but lately everything feels different. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and when Alexander glanced over, he found Samuel watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Alexander's heart was beating too fast, and he could feel the wine making him brave in ways that would probably seem foolish in the morning. Like I've been sleepwalking, and now I'm finally waking up. Samuel's eyes seemed to darken in the dim light from the apartment behind them. 30. The question felt loaded with meaning that Alexander wasn't sure he was ready to unpack. Instead of answering directly, he deflected again, refilling both their wine glasses and changing the subject to Samuel's latest design project. But the conversation stayed with him, replaying in his mind during quiet moments at work, during his morning runs, during the increasingly frequent times when he found himself thinking about Samuel's smile, Samuel's laugh, the way Samuel said his name. By June, Samuel had become such an integral part of Alexander's routine that his absence felt like a physical ache. When Samuel mentioned that he was going to visit his family in California for a week, Alexander's first thought was how empty his apartment would feel without the promise of Samuel's impromptu visits. It's just a week, Samuel said, as if he could read Alexander's thoughts. They were at their usual coffee shop, and Samuel was stirring sugar into his latte with more attention than the task required. Quote 32. Quote Virtin, Alexander said and meant it, even though the thought of a week without Samuel made his chest feel tight. Quote turn to quote done. Samuel's smile was wry. My family has a lot of opinions about my life choices. Moving across the country, ending my engagement to Jennifer, choosing freelance work over a stable corporate job. I'm pretty much the family disappointment. Alexander felt something sharp twist in his stomach at the casual mention of Samuel's ex-fiancée. He knew the basic facts, that Samuel had ended a long-term relationship before moving to the city, but hearing her name made it suddenly, painfully real. Quote 37. The question came out before Alexander could stop it, and he immediately regretted the note of something that sounded suspiciously like jealousy in his voice. Samuel's hand stilled on his coffee cup. For about 6 months, we'd been together since college, and everyone expected us to get married. It seemed like the natural next step. What happened? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Alexander wondered if he'd pushed too far, asked for too much intimacy. But then Samuel looked up, and his eyes held that same vulnerability Alexander had glimpsed on the hiking trail. Quote 40. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow because they echoed his own thoughts about every relationship he'd ever been in. The sense of performing, of trying to feel what he thought he should feel, of always being slightly disconnected from his own emotional experience. That must have been difficult, Alexander said softly. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, Samuel admitted, but also the most honest. I couldn't keep pretending that what we had was enough for either of us. Alexander wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what Samuel meant by loving someone the way he actually felt versus the way he thought he should. But something in Samuel's expression suggested they'd reached the limit of what he was willing to share, at least for now. The week Samuel was in California passed slowly. Alexander found himself checking his phone constantly, hoping for texts that came sporadically and left him wanting more. Samuel sent photos of the wedding, of his family, of the California coastline, and Alexander saved everyone, studying them like they contained secrets he needed to decode. When Samuel finally returned, Alexander felt a rush of relief so intense it scared him. They met for coffee the morning after Samuel's wild flight, and Alexander had to resist the urge to reach out and touch Samuel's arm, just to confirm he was really there. I miss this, Samuel said, settling into his usual chair across from Alexander. The coffee here is so much better than what they serve at my parents' house. Just the coffee? Alexander asked, and immediately wanted to take the words back. They sounded too hopeful, too revealing. Samuel's eyes met his across the small table, and for a moment Alexander thought he saw something flicker there, something that made his pulse quicken. Which is how Samuel said quietly. The summer passed in a blur of shared experiences that felt increasingly precious to Alexander. They developed a routine of weekend hikes, exploring different trails within driving distance of the city. Samuel was an experienced hiker, and he pushed Alexander to attempt more challenging routes than he would have tried on his own. Quote 49. Samuel would say, when Alexander hesitated at the base of a particularly steep trail, quote, and it always was, not just the vista from whatever peak they'd climbed, but the journey itself. The way Samuel would point out interesting plants or rock formations, the way he'd offer his hand when the terrain got tricky, the way they'd sit together at the summit, sharing water and energy bars in comfortable silence. It was during one of these hikes in late July that Alexander first allowed himself to acknowledge what was happening to him. They were sitting on a rocky outcropping, looking out over a valley painted gold by the afternoon sun, and Samuel was telling a story about his college roommate's disastrous attempt at rock climbing. Samuel's face was animated, his hands gesturing as he talked, and Alexander found himself studying the curve of Samuel's mouth, the way his eyes lit up when he laughed. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was falling in love with Samuel Nguyen. Not the complicated, performative emotion he tried to feel for the women he dated. Not the intellectual appreciation he'd convinced himself was enough. This was something elemental, undeniable, terrifying in its intensity. He was in love with his best friend. He was in love with a man. The second realization should have been more shocking than the first, but somehow it wasn't. It felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place, explaining years of relationships that never quite worked, dates that felt like elaborate performances, the sense that he was always slightly out of step with his own life. Quote 51. Samuel's voice brought Alexander back to the present, and he realized he'd been staring, lost in the overwhelming clarity of his revelation. He managed, but burned. Samuel's eyes searched his face with concern. Thinking about what? About you, Alexander thought. About how everything makes sense now. About how I've been lying to myself for years. About how I'm completely and utterly in love with you, and I have no idea what to do about it. Work stuff, he said instead. Sorry, I didn't mean to zone out. Samuel didn't look entirely convinced, but he let it go, turning back to the view spread out below them. Alexander tried to focus on the landscape, on anything other than the way the sunlight caught in Samuel's hair, the way his profile looked like something that should be carved in marble. The knowledge of his feelings changed everything and nothing. Alexander found himself hyper-aware of every interaction, every casual touch, every moment of eye contact that lasted a beat too long. Samuel thankfully seemed oblivious to Alexander's internal revolution, continuing to treat their friendship with the same easy affection he always had. But Alexander began to notice things he'd previously dismissed or ignored. The way Samuel's eyes would sometimes linger on his face during conversation. The way Samuel always seemed to find excuses to touch him, adjusting his hiking pack, brushing dirt off his shirt, placing a steadying hand on his back when they navigated tricky terrain. Quote 57. Samuel observed one evening in August. They were making dinner together in Alexander's kitchen, a routine that had become second nature. Samuel was chopping vegetables while Alexander handled the pasta, and the domestic intimacy of it made Alexander's chest ache with longing. Quote 58. Alexander asked, though he suspected he knew what Samuel meant. He'd been trying to act normal, but the effort was exhausting. Quieter, more thoughtful, like you're working through something complicated. Alexander focused intently on stirring the pasta sauce, using the task as an excuse to avoid Samuel's perceptive gaze. Quote 60 quote Samson. The offer was gentle, without pressure, and it made Alexander's resolve waver. For a moment, he considered telling Samuel everything, about his realization on the mountain, about the way his feelings had shifted and crystallized, about how being in love with Samuel felt like the most natural thing in the world, and also like standing on the edge of a cliff. But the risk was too great. Samuel had never given any indication that he might be interested in men, and Alexander couldn't bear the thought of losing their friendship by making things awkward with an unwanted confession. Quote 62, Alexander said finally. Samuel was quiet for a moment, and when Alexander glanced over, he found Samuel watching him with an expression that seemed almost sad. Quote 63, Samuel said softly. Quote 64. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow because they were exactly what he needed to hear and exactly what made this situation so impossible. Samuel wasn't going anywhere, which meant Alexander would have to live with this secret, this beautiful, terrible knowledge, for as long as their friendship lasted. I know, Alexander said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. I trust you. Samuel smiled then, soft and understanding, and reached out to squeeze Alexander's shoulder. The touch sent electricity shooting through Alexander's body, and he had to turn away to hide his reaction. As August melted into September, Alexander found himself caught in an increasingly difficult balancing act. He wanted to spend every possible moment with Samuel, but being around him was also a constant reminder of what Alexander couldn't have. Every shared laugh, every casual touch, every moment of easy intimacy was both a gift and a form of exquisite torture. Samuel, meanwhile, seemed to be going through his own period of introspection. He was quieter than usual, more prone to thoughtful silences, and Alexander caught him staring into space with a furrowed brow more than once. Quote 67. Alexander asked one Saturday morning as they prepared for their weekly hike. Samuel had been unusually subdued since picking Alexander up, responding to conversation with distracted one-word answers. Quote 68. Samuel replied, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. They drove to the trailhead in relative silence, the easy chatter that usually filled their car rides replaced by a tension that Alexander couldn't identify. Samuel seemed lost in his own thoughts, and Alexander didn't want to push, even though the change in dynamic made him anxious. The trail they'd chosen was one of their favorites, a moderate climb through dense forest that opened up to a series of meadows dotted with wildflowers. They'd hiked it several times before, but today felt different. Samuel set a faster pace than usual, and Alexander found himself struggling to keep up. Sam, slow down, Alexander called when they'd been hiking for about an hour. Samuel stopped abruptly, turning to face Alexander with an expression that seemed almost panicked. About 71, Alexander studied Samuel's face, noting the tension around his eyes, the way his hands were clenched at his sides. What's going on? You've been weird all morning. Samuel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Alexander recognized as a sign of stress. I've been thinking about some things, and I can't seem to turn my brain off. What kind of things? Samuel looked away, focusing on the trail ahead, rather than meeting Alexander's eyes. Quote 75. Alexander felt his heart start to race. There was something in Samuel's tone, something vulnerable and uncertain, that made him wonder if Samuel might be dealing with his own revelations. Maybe talking about it would help, Alexander offered carefully. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Alexander could practically see him wrestling with some internal debate. Finally, Samuel looked back at him, and his eyes held a vulnerability that made Alexander's breath catch. Quote 77. Alexander nodded, not trusting his voice. Quote 78. Ito. The question hit so close to home that Alexander felt momentarily dizzy. Quote 79. He said quietly. Quote audience quotes at 81. Alexander's heart was beating so hard he was sure Samuel could hear it. The questions felt loaded with meaning, and he found himself hoping desperately that they were having the conversation he thought they were having. I think, Alexander said carefully, that real feelings don't require effort. They just exist, whether you want them to or not. And when you try to force something that isn't there, it always feels like work. Samuel's eyes searched his face intently. Quote 84. Alexander's mouth went dry. Then maybe your life was supposed to go in a different direction than you thought. They stood there in the middle of the trail, the silence stretching between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Alexander could see Samuel processing his words, could practically watch him working through some internal struggle. Samuel, Alexander said softly, taking a step closer, what's this really about? Samuel's eyes met his, and for a moment, Alexander thought he was about to get an answer that would change everything. But then Samuel's expression shuddered, and he stepped back, breaking the moment. Nothing, Samuel said, but his voice was tight. Just overthinking things, like always. Come on, let's keep going. He turned and started up the trail again, leaving Alexander to follow, his mind racing with questions and possibilities he didn't dare voice. The rest of September passed in a strange dance of almost conversations and loaded silences. Samuel seemed to be wrestling with something, and Alexander found himself caught between hoping it was what he thought it might be and being terrified of reading too much into every interaction. Their friendship took on a new intensity, as if both of them were aware that something was shifting beneath the surface, but neither was ready to name it. Samuel started finding excuses to touch Alexander more frequently. Casual contact that felt anything but casual. A hand on his back when they were walking together, fingers brushing when they passed each other coffee cups, lingering hugs goodbye that left Alexander's skin tingling. You know, Samuel said one evening as they sat on Alexander's couch, ostensibly watching a movie, but mostly just talking. Good night. Alexander turned to look at Samuel, who was sitting closer than usual, close enough that Alexander could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Samuel's voice was soft, and there was something in his expression that made Alexander's pulse quicken. 94. Quote after Alexander replied honestly. Quote 96. Samuel's eyes dropped to Alexander's mouth for just a moment before flicking back up, and Alexander felt his breath catch. The air between them seemed charged with possibility, and Alexander found himself leaning slightly closer without conscious thought. But then Samuel's phone buzzed with a text message, breaking the moment, and Samuel pulled back, reaching for his phone with hands that Alexander noticed were slightly unsteady. Sorry, Samuel muttered, reading the message. Work thing. The moment passed, but it left Alexander with a sense of anticipation that made it hard to focus on anything else. Something was building between them, something that felt inevitable and terrifying in equal measure. October brought cooler weather and the brilliant colors of autumn. Their weekend hikes became even more precious as the season changed, each one feeling like it might be their last chance before winter made the trails impassable. It was on one of these October hikes that Samuel finally began to open up about what had been troubling him. They were sitting by a small lake, eating lunch and watching the reflection of red and gold leaves shimmer on the water's surface. Quote 99, Samuel said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence they'd been sharing. Alexander turned to look at him, noting the nervous energy in Samuel's posture. Samuel was quiet for a moment, seemingly gathering his courage. Bob Swan. Alexander felt his stomach clench, but he kept his expression neutral. Old quote one, quote a hand on, quote a harm. Samuel picked up a small stone and skipped it across the lake, watching the ripples spread outward. Quote honomo, the words hung in the air between them, loaded with implication. Alexander felt his heart start to race, but he forced himself to respond carefully. Quote 106, he said. Quote Oshajan, quote Punan. Samuel turned to look at him directly. Quote Beintum. Alexander met Samuel's gaze, seeing the vulnerability there, the genuine need for understanding. Yes, he said quietly, more than I'd like to admit. Samuel nodded slowly, as if this confirmation meant something important to him. Sometimes I feel like I've been sleepwalking through my own life, like I've been so focused on doing what was expected that I never stopped to ask what I actually wanted. And what do you want? Alexander asked, echoing the question Samuel had posed to him months earlier. Samuel's eyes searched Alexander's face, and for a moment Alexander thought he might finally get the answer that would change everything between them. I want to stop pretending, Samuel said finally. I want to stop trying to force feelings that aren't there and start acknowledging the ones that are. Alexander's heart was beating so hard he was sure Samuel could hear it. Quote 116. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Alexander could see him wrestling with something, some internal debate that seemed to be causing him genuine distress. Quote 117, Samuel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Quote at 118, went on, Alexander felt the world shift around him, everything suddenly sharp and bright and full of possibility. Quote to 1, Samuel's eyes searched his face intently. Even if they're completely different from anything you felt before, even if they don't fit with how you thought your life was supposed to go? Especially then, Alexander replied, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to contain. Samuel looked away, back toward the lake, but Alexander could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched in his lap. I'm scared, Samuel admitted quietly. Of what? Of ruining everything, of losing the best thing in my life because I can't figure out how to keep my feelings in their proper place. Alexander felt something inside his chest crack open, hope flooding in so fast it was almost painful. Samuel, he said softly, and waited until Samuel looked at him again. What if the proper place for your feelings isn't where you think it is? Samuel's eyes widened slightly, and Alexander could see him processing the implication of those words. For a moment they sat in perfect silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. But then Samuel's phone rang, shattering the moment, and Samuel answered it with shaking hands, his voice carefully controlled as he spoke to whoever was on the other end. The call was brief, something about a work deadline, but by the time Samuel hung up, the moment had passed, and they were left with the awkwardness of a conversation interrupted just as it was becoming crucial. They packed up their lunch in relative silence and headed back down the trail, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Alexander's mind was racing, replaying every word of their conversation, trying to decode the meaning behind Samuel's careful admissions. The hike back to the car felt different from their usual easy companionship. There was a tension between them now, an awareness of something hovering just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. Samuel seemed lost in his own thoughts, and Alexander found himself studying Samuel's profile, wondering what was going through his mind. As October progressed, their interactions became increasingly charged with unspoken tension. Samuel seemed to be struggling with some internal battle, and Alexander found himself walking on eggshells, afraid to push too hard, but desperate to understand what Samuel was thinking. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in late October. Alexander was working late at his apartment when Samuel showed up at his door, looking disheveled and slightly panicked. Quote V7. Samuel asked, and his voice had a quality Alexander had never heard before, something urgent and vulnerable. Quote 28. Alexander said, stepping aside to let Samuel enter. Quote 129. Samuel ran his hands through his hair, pacing Alexander's small living room like a caged animal. I need to tell you something, and I don't know how to say it without ruining everything. Alexander felt his heart start to race. Samuel, whatever it is, we can figure it out. Just talk to me. Samuel stopped pacing and turned to face Alexander, his eyes wintering and slightly desperate. What if I told you that I think I've been lying to myself about who I am, about what I want? I'd say that takes a lot of courage to admit. What if I told you that I think the reason my relationship with Jennifer didn't work wasn't because we were incompatible, but because I was trying to love her the way I thought I should, instead of accepting that I might not be capable of loving any woman the way she deserved? Alexander's breath caught in his throat. Quote 35. Samuel's hands were shaking now, and he clenched them into fists at his sides. What if I told you that I think I might be gay, and that the reason I figured it out is because I've fallen in love with my best friend? The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Alexander felt like the world had stopped spinning, like everything in his life had been leading to this single moment of perfect, impossible possibility. I'd say, Alexander replied, his voice barely above a whisper, that your best friend might have fallen in love with you too. Samuel's face went through a series of expressions so quickly that Alexander could barely track them. Shock, hope, disbelief, and something that looked like relief all flickered across his features in the span of a few seconds. Samuel said, and his voice cracked on the name, quote 140. Alexander took a step closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. Quote 141. Samuel's eyes filled with tears and he let out a shaky laugh. How long have you known? About yourself, I mean. Since July. That day we hiked to Sunset Peak, and you were telling that story about your college roommate. I was watching you talk, and it just hit me like lightning. I was in love with you, and I was gay, and everything in my life suddenly made sense. Samuel shook his head in amazement. I've been going crazy trying to figure out if what I was feeling was real, and if I was just confused or lonely or something. I kept telling myself it was impossible, that I couldn't be in love with you because I'd never felt this way about a man before. And now, Samuel took a step closer, close enough that Alexander could see the tears clinging to his eyelashes. Now I think I understand the difference between trying to love someone and actually loving them. I think I understand why every relationship I have ever had felt like I was playing a role. Alexander reached out tentatively, his fingers barely brushing Samuel's hand. 147. Samuel's fingers intertwined with his, and the simple contact sent electricity shooting up Alexander's arm. Go to 48, Samuel admitted. Quote 49. Alexander squeezed Samuel's hand gently. We don't have to figure everything out tonight. We can take this as slowly as you need to. Samuel's eyes searched Alexander's face, and Alexander could see the war between fear and hope playing out in his expression. What if I'm not good at this? What if I don't know how to be what you need? Samuel, Alexander said softly, bringing his free hand up to cup Samuel's cheek. Quote 153. Samuel leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering closed. Quote 154. Quote 151. Alexander whispered, and then, because he'd been wanting to for months, he leaned in and pressed his lips gently to Samuel's. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question more than a statement. Samuel went very still for a moment, and Alexander started to pull back, afraid he'd pushed too fast. But then Samuel's hands came up to frame Alexander's face, and he kissed back with a desperation that made Alexander's knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together. Quote, Samuel whispered. Quote, one was some Alexander agreed, his voice rough. Quote, one Samuel pulled back slightly to look at Alexander, and his eyes were bright with wonder. Quote 159, quote 160, quote 161. Alexander smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. Quote 162. Samuel's expression grew serious. Now I guess we figure out how to do this, how to be together. I'm going to need time to process all of this, to figure out what it means for my life. Take all the time you need, Alexander said. I'm not going anywhere. Samuel's smile was radiant. Quote, when Oscar, quote, Washington, they spent the rest of the evening and talking, curled up together on Alexander's couch in a way that felt both completely natural and thrillingly new. Samuel asked questions about Alexander's journey of self-discovery, and Alexander shared the confusion and fear he'd experienced when he first acknowledged his feelings. I kept thinking there must be something wrong with me, Alexander admitted. I dated women, had relationships that looked normal from the outside, but I always felt like I was performing, like I was trying to convince myself I felt something I didn't actually feel. Samuel nodded emphatically. That's exactly how I felt with Jennifer. I loved her, but not in the way she needed to be loved. I thought maybe I was just emotionally unavailable, or that I needed to try harder. When did you first start questioning things? Samuel was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on Alexander's arm. Quote 172. Alexander remembered that moment vividly. Samuel had been nervous about the water crossing, and Alexander had instinctively reached out to help. When their hands connected, Alexander had felt that same jolt, but he dismissed it as wishful thinking. I felt it too, Alexander said softly. I kept finding excuses to touch you after that, just to see if I'd imagined it. Samuel laughed, the sound warm and delighted. I thought I was going crazy. I'd never been attracted to a man before, and suddenly I couldn't stop thinking about my hiking buddy's hands. They talked until nearly midnight, sharing months of suppressed feelings and observations, marveling at how many of their experiences had been parallel. When Samuel finally left, with a soft kiss goodbye that left Alexander's lips tingling, Alexander felt like his entire world had been transformed. The next few weeks were a careful dance of exploration and discovery. Samuel was true to his word about needing time to process, and Alexander respected his pace, content to let Samuel set the boundaries of their new relationship. They continued their usual routines, hiking on weekends and sharing dinners during the week. But everything felt different now. The casual touches that had once felt loaded with unspoken possibility now carried the weight of acknowledged attraction. Samuel would reach for Alexander's hand while they walked, or lean against him on the couch while they watched movies, and Alexander felt like he was living in a dream. I keep waiting for this to feel weird or wrong, Samuel admitted one evening as they sat on Alexander's balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Quote 127, quote 129. Samuel considered the question, his fingers playing with the stem of his wineglass. Quote Waddington, quote Waddington. Samuel turned to look at Alexander, his eyes soft with affection. Quote Itwanan. Alexander felt his heart swell with emotion so intense it was almost painful. Quote gratitude, he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Samuel's eyes widened, and for a moment, Alexander worried he had said too much too soon. But then Samuel's face broke into a smile so radiant it could have powered the city. I love you too, Samuel replied, his voice thick with emotion. I think I have loved you for months, but I was too scared to admit it, even to myself. Alexander set down his wineglass and reached for Samuel, pulling him close for a kiss that tasted like wine and promises and the beginning of everything beautiful. November brought the first snow and a deepening of their relationship that felt both gradual and inevitable. Samuel grew more comfortable with physical affection, and Alexander marveled at how natural it felt to hold Samuel's hand, to kiss him goodbye, to wake up next to him on the mornings when Samuel stayed over. Quote 185. Samuel said one Sunday morning as they lay in bed, watching snow fall outside Alexander's bedroom window. About us, about who I am. I'm tired of hiding. Alexander turned to look at Samuel, noting the determination in his expression. Are you ready for that? It might not go the way you hope. Samuel was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on Alexander's chest. Quote 188, quote 189, Alexander said, pressing a kiss to Samuel's forehead. Samuel's conversation with his family was difficult, as they'd both expected. His parents struggled to understand, and his sister was supportive, but worried about the implications for Samuel's future. But Samuel handled it all with a grace and honesty that made Alexander fall even more deeply in love with him. Quote 190, Samuel said after a particularly difficult phone call with his mother. Quote 191. Alexander admired Samuel's optimism and patience with his family's adjustment period. It made him realize how lucky he was that his own coming out, when he finally worked up the courage to tell his parents and close friends, was met with nothing but love and support. Quote which his mother said, but when he called to tell her about Samuel. Quote 193. December arrived with a sense of completion, as if the year had been building toward this moment of perfect contentment. Alexander and Samuel had fallen into a rhythm that felt like they'd been together for years rather than months. They spent Christmas Eve at Alexander's apartment, cooking an elaborate dinner together and exchanging gifts that spoke to how well they'd come to know each other. Samuel gave Alexander a framed photograph from one of their early hikes, the one where Alexander had first realized he was in love. In the photo, Alexander was laughing at something Samuel had said, his face bright with joy, and Samuel had somehow captured the exact moment when everything changed. "I took this without you knowing," Samuel admitted, as Alexander stared at the photo with tears in his eyes. "You looked so happy, so free, and I wanted to remember that moment forever." Alexander's gift to Samuel was a leather-bound journal with their initials embossed on the cover. "Good to your own," Alexander explained. "Good 27." Samuel's eyes filled with tears as he ran his fingers over the cover. "I love it. I love you." "I love you too," Alexander replied. And the words felt like a promise, like a vow, like the beginning of a story that would last the rest of their lives. As winter deepened into January, their relationship settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt both exciting and secure. Samuel had officially moved in with Alexander, though the transition had been so gradual that neither of them could pinpoint exactly when it had happened. Samuel's clothes had slowly migrated to Alexander's closet. His books had found homes on Alexander's shelves, and his coffee maker had taken up permanent residence on Alexander's kitchen counter. "I should probably give up my lease," Samuel said one morning as he made coffee in what they now thought of as their kitchen. "I haven't slept at my place in 3 weeks." Alexander looked up from his laptop, where he was answering work emails, and felt a flutter of nervous excitement. "Are you sure? That's a pretty big step." Samuel turned to face him, 2 coffee mugs in his hands, and his expression was serious but certain. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. This feels like home, Alex. You feel like home." Alexander stood and crossed to Samuel, taking one of the coffee mugs and setting both of them aside so he could pull Samuel into his arms. "Then let's make it official. Move in with me. Properly, I mean." Samuel's smile was brilliant. Quote 205. The process of officially combining their lives was surprisingly smooth. Samuel's furniture blended perfectly with Alexander's, and they discovered they had complementary domestic skills that made sharing space feel natural rather than complicated. Samuel was an excellent cook, and Alexander was organized and detail-oriented, so their household ran with an efficiency that impressed both of them. Quote 206. Samuel observed one evening as they sat on their couch, Alexander reading while Samuel worked on a design project on his laptop. Quote 207. Alexander glanced up from his book and smiled at the picture they made. Samuel's feet were tucked under Alexander's thigh, and Alexander's free hand was absently stroking Samuel's ankle. It was comfortable and intimate and perfectly ordinary, and Alexander loved every second of it. Alexander asked. Samuel's eyes softened. "It's the best thing. I never understood what people meant when they talked about finding their person, but now I get it. You're my person, Alex." "You're mine too," Alexander replied, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. February brought challenges that tested their still new relationship. Samuel's family was planning a visit, and Samuel was nervous about introducing Alexander as his boyfriend rather than just his friend. Alexander's work was going through a period of intense pressure, and he was putting in long hours that left him exhausted and sometimes short-tempered. "I'm sorry," Alexander said one evening after snapping at Samuel over something trivial. "I'm just stressed about this project and I'm taking it out on you, which isn't fair." Samuel pulled Alexander into a hug, and Alexander melted into the embrace, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. "We're going to have bad days," Samuel said softly. "That's normal. What matters is how we handle them." "How did you get so wise about relationships?" Alexander asked, pressing his face into Samuel's neck and breathing in his familiar scent. Samuel laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. Quote 206, quote to him in quote in ants. Alexander pulled back to look at Samuel, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. "Quote to I and quote to morning," Samuel said and kissed him with a tenderness that made Alexander's chest ache with happiness. Samuel's family visit went better than expected. His parents were polite, if somewhat reserved, but his sister was genuinely warm toward Alexander. And by the end of the weekend, even his parents had begun to relax around him. Samuel said after his family had left for the airport. Alexander replied honestly. Samuel's eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for being so patient with them. I know it wasn't easy being scrutinized like that." "It was worth it," Alexander said, pulling Samuel close. "You're worth it." Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a renewed sense of possibility. They resumed their weekend hiking routine, exploring new trails and revisiting old favorites. The mountains were coming alive with wildflowers and new growth, and Alexander felt like his own life was blooming in parallel. "I want to take you somewhere special," Samuel said one Saturday morning as they prepared for their weekly hike. "There's a trail I found online that's supposed to have incredible views, but it's a bit more challenging than our usual routes." Alexander was intrigued. "How challenging?" "About 6 miles with some steep sections, but the photos online are amazing and I think it's worth the effort." Alexander trusted Samuel's judgment about hiking, so he agreed, and they set off for what would become one of the most meaningful days of their relationship. The trail was indeed challenging, winding up through dense forest before opening into a series of meadows that took Alexander's breath away. Wildflowers carpeted the ground in brilliant splashes of color, and the views of the surrounding mountains were spectacular. "This is incredible," Alexander said as they stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook. "How did you find this place?" Samuel was uncharacteristically quiet, and when Alexander looked at him, he noticed that Samuel seemed nervous, his hands fidgeting with his water bottle. "Actually," Samuel said, his voice slightly unsteady, "I had an ulterior motive for bringing you here." Alexander felt his heart skip a beat. "What kind of ulterior motive?" Samuel set down his water bottle and turned to face Alexander fully, his expression serious but warm. "Alex, this past year has been the best of my life. You've helped me discover who I really am, and you've loved me through every step of that discovery. I can't imagine my life without you." Alexander's breath caught as Samuel reached into his backpack and pulled out a small velvet box. "Quotient 238. Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. Quote 239. Samuel opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring. Quote 240. Alexander stared at the ring, then at Samuel's hopeful, nervous face, and felt his world shift on its axis once again. But this time, instead of the terrifying uncertainty he'd felt when he first realized he was in love with Samuel, he felt only joy, pure and bright and overwhelming. Quote 241, Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. Quote 2. Samuel's face broke into a grin so wide it looked like it might split his face in half. With shaking hands, he slipped the ring onto Alexander's finger, and then they were kissing, laughing, crying, holding each other like they never wanted to let go. Quoted 243. Samuel whispered against Alexander's lips, "I can't wait to marry you." "I love you too," Alexander replied, admiring the way the ring caught the sunlight. "When did you know? When did you decide you wanted to propose?" Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. 247. Alexander nodded, remembering that day vividly. "It felt like a lifetime ago," Samuel admitted with a sheepish smile. Alexander felt his heart swell with love and amazement. Quote 250. Quote 251, Samuel said softly. Quote 252. Alexander thought about that first meeting, about the instant connection he'd felt, about how natural it had seemed to offer to show Samuel around the neighborhood. "I felt it too," he said. "Ashibayo," he said. "I didn't understand it at the time, but I felt it." They spent the rest of the afternoon on the mountain, talking about their future, making plans for their wedding, marveling at how perfectly their lives had aligned. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, they packed up their things and began the hike back to the car. "I have one more confession," Samuel said as they walked hand in hand down the trail. "That day when I said I wanted to clear my head and then walk next to you the entire way, I wasn't just walking next to you. I was trying to work up the courage to tell you how I felt." Alexander squeezed Samuel's hand. Quote 257. Quote 258. Samuel paused, then added with a smile. Quote 259. Quote to Sixto. Alexander admitted with a laugh. Quote charm. Quote charm, Samuel pointed out. Quote charm, Alexander considered this as they continued down the trail, their hands still intertwined, their matching footsteps creating a rhythm that felt like music. Quote Ashashin. As they reached the parking lot and loaded their gear into the car, Alexander felt a sense of completion that he'd never experienced before. The scared, confused man who had first realized he was in love with his best friend seemed like a stranger now. In his place was someone who understood himself, who had found love and acceptance in a future bright with possibility. The months that followed their engagement passed in a blur of wedding planning and deepening intimacy. They decided on a small ceremony in the mountains, at the same overlook where Samuel had proposed. The guest list was limited to close family and friends, but the love and support they felt from their chosen community was overwhelming. I still can't believe this is real sometimes, Alexander said one evening, as they sat on their balcony, looking through wedding magazines and making lists of details to finalize. A year ago, I thought I was destined to be alone, or at best, stuck in relationships that felt like elaborate performances. Samuel looked up from the florist's catalog he'd been studying. What changed? You, Alexander said simply. Meeting you changed everything. You helped me understand the difference between what I thought I wanted and what I actually needed. Samuel set aside the catalog and moved closer to Alexander on the small love seat they'd squeezed onto the balcony. What's out to 70? Alexander leaned into Samuel's warmth, marveling at how natural this kind of physical affection had become. Do you ever miss it? The certainty of following the expected path? Samuel was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it, yet he admitted. There's something appealing about knowing exactly what's expected of you, about having a clear roadmap for your life. But I don't miss the feeling of being disconnected from my own experience. What do you mean? With Jennifer, with all my previous relationships, I always felt like I was watching my life happen from the outside, like I was playing a role in someone else's story. With you, I feel like I'm finally living my own life. Alexander understood exactly what Samuel meant. The sense of authenticity he felt in their relationship was unlike anything he'd experienced before. Every moment felt real, immediate, significant in a way that his previous relationships had never achieved. Quote 276, Alexander said softly. Quote 277. Samuel smiled and pressed a kiss to Alexander's temple. I love our story too, and I love that we're still writing it. Their wedding day dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect mountain weather that made everything look like a postcard. Alexander stood at the makeshift altar they'd set up at the overlook, watching Samuel walk toward him with tears in his eyes and love written across his face. The ceremony was simple but profound. They'd written their own vows, and when Samuel spoke about finding the courage to live authentically and about the transformative power of love, there wasn't a dry eye among their small gathering of witnesses. Quote 279, Samuel said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his cheeks. Quote 280. Alexander's own vows focused on the journey they'd taken together, from confusion to clarity, from friendship to love, from hiding to living friendly and proudly. Quote 281. Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. Quote Haru. When they kissed as newly married husbands, Alexander felt like everything in his life had led to this moment. This perfect culmination of a journey that had started with a chance meeting in a coffee shop and led them through months of discovery, confession, and ultimately, this beautiful commitment. The reception was held at a nearby lodge, and as Alexander and Samuel danced their first dance as a married couple, Alexander couldn't help but think about how far they'd both come. The scared, confused men who had spent months circling each other, afraid to acknowledge their feelings, had been replaced by two people who were secure in their love and confident in their future together. 283. Samuel asked as they swayed to music that seemed to exist just for them. Quote, Alexander replied, quote 285. Samuel's eyes sparkled with tears and laughter. I'm thinking about how patient you were with me while I figured everything out. How you never pushed, never made me feel rushed or pressured. We had all the time in the world, Alexander said, spinning Samuel gently in his arms. We still do. As the evening wound down and their guests began to say their goodbyes, Alexander and Samuel found themselves alone on the lodge's deck, looking out at the mountains that had witnessed their entire love story. Samuel asked, echoing the question Alexander had posed on the night they'd first confessed their feelings. Alexander smiled, pulling Samuel close and marveling at the solid weight of the wedding ring on his finger. Now we keep hiking together, we keep discovering new trails, new views, new ways to love each other. That sounds perfect, Samuel said, and kissed him under a sky full of stars. As they drove home that night, still in their wedding clothes, still glowing with the joy of the day, Alexander reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. It hadn't been easy, learning to accept and embrace a part of himself he'd never understood. It hadn't been simple, navigating the complexities of a relationship that challenged everything he thought he knew about love and attraction. but it had been worth it. Every moment of confusion, every spike of fear, every difficult conversation had led them to this place of perfect contentment, this sense of being exactly where they belonged. "I have something for you," Samuel said as they pulled into their driveway. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small wrapped package. A wedding gift. Alexander opened it carefully and found a compass, engraved with their wedding date and the coordinates of the overlook where Samuel had proposed. "So we never lose our way," Samuel explained softly. "No matter what trails we explore, we'll always be able to find our way back to where our story really began." Alexander felt tears prick his eyes as he ran his thumb over the engraving. "It's perfect. Thank you." "Thank you," Samuel replied, "for being brave enough to walk beside me, even when neither of us knew where we were going." As they walked hand in hand up to their front door, Alexander thought about all the trails that lay ahead of them, all the adventures they would share, all the ways their love would continue to grow and deepen. The future stretched out before them like an unmarked path through beautiful country, full of possibilities and promise. And Samuel would be there beside him for every step of the journey, just as he had been from the very beginning when he'd said he wanted to clear his head, but had really just wanted to walk next to the man who would become his husband, his partner, his home. The end of their wedding day felt like the beginning of everything else, and Alexander couldn't wait to see where their shared path would lead them next. Whatever challenges or joys awaited them, they would face them together, hand in hand, step by step. Two people who had found in each other not just love, but the courage to live authentically and the strength to build a life that was entirely their own.